Everybody, it's Eugene Lisho, and welcome to episode 56 of Forensics Talks. I want to welcome everybody here. And don't forget that we are live streaming to YouTube, to Facebook, LinkedIn, and also we have podcasts. So just very shortly at the turn of the year here, I've taken a whole number of these talks, and through the suggestion of some of the listeners, I said, hey, we'll put it on to audio format. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, then it's on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on most of the major apps and such that will broadcast podcasts. Now, remember, you can let us know where you're from in the chat window. Always like to know where people are watching from, which is fantastic. Make sure to place any questions as well for our guest. And just really one announcement before we get started here today, and that is that I have announced that next week I'm going to be having the photogrammetry course. It's for forensics. And if you're using a digital camera to document evidence, whether it's large evidence, small evidence, whatever it might be, if you're using a drone, then photogrammetry might be for you. So this is a course where I go from zero to hero kind of thing and teach you all the basics about photogrammetry. Also, one of the lucky students next week is going to win a full version of the software that we're using, which is 3ds Zephyr. So I'm hoping that's going to be a bit of fun for next week. So if you're interested, all you have to do is you can just go to the website, the ai2-3d.com, and actually you'll see a banner when you first get into it. If you click on it, then you'll get to the page that I'm showing here. And so I will move on from there. I also want to say a hello to a lot of the people who are in Denver this week at the International Association of Forensic and Security Metrology, and also the Association of Crime Scene Reconstruction. One thing in forensics you got to get used to is all the acronyms, mouthfuls, that's for sure. So let's get started. And I can already see some people are saying hello here. Oh, somebody from Serbia. Great. Thank you. So today, my guest is Professor Lorna Dawson, and she is currently the principal scientist and head of forensic soil science at the James Hutton Institute, visiting professor at Robert Gordon University, chartered scientist, fellow of the Institute of British Soil Scientists, fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. She holds the expert witness certificate for England and Wales and is a registered expert with the National Crime Agency. She works with police forces, lawyers, and agencies in soil trace evidence provision and regularly attends court as an expert witness. She's worked on many notable cases, including the World's End pub murders and the disappearance of a young boy named Ben Needham on one of the Greek islands of Kos. She's published over 100 scientific papers, books, book chapters, and holds a diploma in science communication. And Professor Dawson is passionate about the effective communication of science, and her opinion is widely sought on aspects of soil science and forensic science in various media, including news, education, and drama. And you'll be able to find a lot of information about Professor Dawson on YouTube and on LinkedIn and a number of other places that I'll be posting later on. So let me bring her on here and let me unmute her. And hello, Professor Dawson. How are you?
Hello, Eugene, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and listening to our chat tonight.
Oh, thank you. And I should let everybody know that Lorna is in Scotland and it's her evening, so she's spending some of her time with us today. So that's fantastic. The first question I have for you is, and I often, I don't know why, but for me, it's very interesting. That's to know how people sort of fell into the area that they've been working in, and sort of what was their journey. And I don't mean just more recently, but I mean from a young age. Was there someone in particular? Was there a particular event or something that happened that just the light went off and it said, "Oh, this is I love forensics," or "This is something that I want to do"? Or was it completely different? Was it something else?
Well, I was brought up on a farm in rural Scotland, and I loved being outside. And in those days, we played a lot. We went and picked potatoes. So we would help harvest potato by hand. None of this machinery that you get nowadays. And when I was about 12, I was picking potatoes, and I had a nasty accident, and I broke my leg in two places. And I was lying there and waiting to be rescued. And there was sort of amazing things going through my head. And then when I was convalescing, when I was in a plaster, right up, full leg plaster, I searched out books to read. And what I found was the books of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And he wrote the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And that got me hooked on the idea of deduction and detection and the use of forensics. And indeed, he used soil within several of his stories. The Study of Scarlet, The Hound of the Baskervilles, study, lots of these. He used it as an example of someone had worked out, they'd been at a particular place in London, Wigmore Street, and he deduced that and told Holmes that he knew by the colour and texture of the soil on the shoes of that person just where they'd stood.
Yeah.
So, it was in early days I was fascinated by the whole subject.
Right. And so did you head directly into forensics, or did you head into a different area of study?
Well, with a discipline like forensic soil science or forensic geology, first of all, you would become a geologist or you would become a soil scientist, because it's not like the mainstream forensic science where that's what people go and they study and they decide early on that they want to be a forensic scientist at a crime scene, let's say a crime scene manager or a technician, or be a trace evidence analyst or DNA specialist. That wasn't the way that I went. What I did was I became a soil scientist. So I studied geography and geology as an undergraduate degree, and then I went on to do a PhD in soil science. So I became a doctorate in soil science, knowing that as a discipline and a subject base. And I've stayed as a professional soil scientist all through. So the forensics, the F word, is the topping on that. So it's applying that within the context of the legal system, and not just criminal law, but also civil law and environmental law and wildlife crime. Soil science applies to all those different areas.
I noticed that I'm going to be bringing up some of the papers that you've worked on and such, but there are these little hints inside the papers saying, for example, and I don't remember the exact wording, but something to the effect that, it's not well used in a lot of areas, or, something might be a little bit newer, or some countries are not using it yet, or whatever. So when you began, was soil forensics a big thing, or was it brand new? Was it in its infancy? At what sort of stage was soil forensics at?
Well, that was about 15 to 20 years ago now. And at that stage, it was very rarely used. And when it was used such as the particle size by sieving a soil, or it was the minerals under a microscope, or it was the pollen, but not quantifiable. So it couldn't be accredited, or at that time, it was a single person in their home room looking down a microscope. Whereas over that time, it has standardized, it has become standard operating procedures have been adopted, and it's become recognized worldwide. And it's not only now used in really extremely high profile cases, but it's used right from the outset. So at a forensic strategy meeting at the very outset of a body, let's say, being detected or someone going missing, then forensic geologist or a forensic soil scientist is called in at that point now, certainly within the United Kingdom, Australia, Russia, the USA with the FBI, and in Canada, those countries, also Brazil, there's countries where it's now integral to the investigative process in that country. The Netherlands, Germany, Spain, many countries in Europe, it's adopted within that legal process.
And you mentioned standards, and I'm curious about organizations or the community. Is there a community of soil forensic scientists that come together every now and then, and they talk about standards and different techniques and such, or is it the conference room on the side of the other, of a bigger conference or something?
Well, it's actually a bit of both. So I would, in normal non-COVID times, be attending conferences to do with my discipline. So we're having a congress in August, actually, in Glasgow in Scotland. It's the World Congress of Soil Science. So anybody interested in soil science, please put it in your diary, apply now and come along. It's going to be a great week. And as part of that, we're going to run a day's training course as part of that week for the police. That is also being run as part of the International Union of Geological Sciences Initiative on Forensic Geology. Now, that's an international network, and we've members from America, from Canada, from Brazil, from Russia, from Australia, from New Zealand, from all over the world. And what we do is we are trying to develop common good practice, best practice. And in fact, I'll just show you a book if it's coming out. Probably not, but I can send the details for that later.
Okay.
It's a book we've just produced called A Guide to Forensic Geology. And what it does is it goes through the principles that we have built up and tested over the last 10 to 15 years as an international organization. And what we're doing is we're trying to help by training other scientists in other countries to be able to develop it in their own nation for their own legal system. So that's the international aspect. But also within Europe, we have got, thank you, Eugene. You've done your homework. Brilliant. We've got within the European network of forensic science institutes. This is a gathering of people who professionally work on casework, from DNA specialists right the way through chemists, to include also trace evidence analysts. And there's a working group. It's called the Animal, Plant, Soil Trace Working Group. And again, for that, we developed a best practice document a couple of years ago called Best Practice Manual for the Forensic Comparison of Soil Traces. So that was developed for use within European countries. So there are resources out there now for people to pick up. When I first started, there weren't really many documents we could go to. So we've had to develop them over time and with the experience that we've picked up.
Yeah. Do you find that many law enforcement agencies maybe know where to go? I mean, certainly in your area because they're familiar with you, or maybe maybe in the US or Canada. But do you find that there may be potentially a lot of countries that have no idea that this is even an option for them?
Yes, indeed. And frequently we get requests through this network, IUGS, Initiative Forensic Geology. We get requests to us to say, could we join this network? So it's called the Geoforensics International Network. So as well as there being a core organization who go out and train other scientists and police forces worldwide, there's this international network where we make documents available freely and offer our services to discuss with police forces. We've trained in Abu Dhabi, we have trained in Russia, Brazil, Colombia, plus many more nations. We've gone as a team of people from around the world. Indeed, we've got Grant Waugh, who comes from Canada. He's part of our international network. So yeah, Canada is represented on this growing number of countries across the world. And in fact, I'll just do a plug for his conference that he's holding in Halifax, May 15th to 18th. It's the Geological Association of Canada, and they're hosting a week event. And part of that, we'll be training one day the local police. So,
excellent. Yeah, it's fantastic. So let me start asking you questions about soil itself, because you can imagine soil from all over the world, all types of different shapes and sizes and composition and everything else. So I have to say, I mean, soil must be complex. And so what is the makeup? What are the kinds of things that you can look at inside of soil?
Well, that's one of the wonderful things about soil, its complexity. Because soils are so diverse and they vary so much across the world, soils develop from the parent material, the geology. So as we know, that underlying geology can vary so much depending on what minerals have formed that bedrock. Then there's the vegetation on top of that, which breaks down, decomposes, and leaves behind organic signature. And then you've got the biological component, the living organisms that are in that soil. So if you think of it as a three-phased media, you've got the inorganic phase, the organic phase, and the biological phase, the DNA. Now, there's multitude of methods that you can use to characterize those different phases. And depending on the different types of soil you've got in your locality and indeed in your nation, you'll use different methods. You use the most appropriate methods for the types of soil you've got. I'll use the example of the Netherlands, for example, where a lot of their soils are man-made and they've been mixed up. So they use pollen because that discriminates quite well the different habitats that are across that country. And they use elemental profiling. That's the elements that are in a soil. They don't use mineralogy, and they don't use some of these other methods that other countries would, like in the States, the USA. They use the minerals that are in a soil to characterize the parent material, because you've got many, many different types of rocks there. So it's almost like an ideal trace evidence type, because it's so varied and because it varies spatially. And we can use that when we're asked to say, where could this soil on the spade have come from? If we're being asked by the law enforcement to say, help them narrow down an area of search, because we can link the analysis that we do to that question sample from the spade and compare it with the information we've got on databases and maps and say, well, it couldn't have come from the rocks up there. It couldn't have come from the mountains. It couldn't have come from the grassland. It's definitely come from an area of coniferous woodland, and it's got this granitic parent material. So therefore, you take your layer of granite, you take your layer of coniferous woodland, you take your layer of information about where the person was last traveling, and you've already identified and focused on areas to prioritize the valuable time that the police then go and search.
Ah, interesting. So so things like the color, the particle sizes, the types of minerals that are in there. But what I heard you say though too is, depending on the location of where this is, you may put greater emphasis on one thing or the other.
Yes, absolutely. Because in Scotland we've got very organic soils, they're very acid. What we have resulted in is a lot of information in that organic fraction of the soil, so that as the soil organic matter breaks down, not everything disappears. So material is left there for hundreds of years. But every year, some new material decays and breaks down and deposits are left. That all leaves behind quite a complicated signature that we can analyze using gas chromatography. And each soil will have a distinctive profile. And if we interpret that profile of an unknown, a question sample, we don't know where it's come from, we'll be able to say, that's an upland grassland with some heather. And previously it had been under a coniferous forest. So we can start to interpret it like our own detective work in soil science. We work out where that soil could have come from based on both the organics, but also we do the mineralogy. And that would tell us, well, it's on a sandstone or it's on a carbonate rock, or we would start to build up using, we have a team of experts at the James Hutton Institute. So and myself, I specialize in the organic analysis and interpretation, whereas Professor Hillier, he's a world-renowned mineralogist, so he would do the interpretation of the mineralogy. So, and also if there's diatoms, we would introduce the expert in diatoms, or if there's DNA work to be done, then the biologist would come into the team. So, yeah, no, it's always different depending on the different soils. And then other countries use different methods. Colors used in Japan because they've got volcanic origin soils. So soils vary by a huge amount of differences in their colors, whereas we don't tend to get as many differences. We do get differences, but not to the same extent as in Japan.
So when you're working with the police, let's say, and they have a sample on a whatever, it's a suspected weapon or on a suspect shoe or a vehicle or something like that, do they bring you a sample from a suspected location as well or whatever? Because I didn't realize, it makes perfect sense now, but there are databases which exist as well. So do you often just work with the most current samples that are taken, or where are these databases and who makes them?
Well, every case is different, from someone reported missing and an item of footwear being immediately sent up to our labs to try and do a 24-hour analysis. So we could run a pH, we could run an ICP, we could get an elemental profile, we could do FTIR, use SEM. So we could do that very quickly. If this is a missing person, then we would prioritize that, and then that would help the police narrow down where to go in that vital 24 hours when someone goes missing. Or it could be a cold case where all leads have run dry and they've gone back and reviewed the case, and they've found that in some of these samples, there were soils that were stored there from 30 years ago, but it had not been considered. Or there was material that was left behind and there was debris on that material. And therefore, those would then be submitted to our labs, and we would examine in situ those items of footwear or clothing, recover the soil carefully. And that's a crucial stage, because sometimes on items, there's layers of material. And this went back hundreds of years when George Pop came up with the principle of stratigraphy, and how that can tell us someone's been to several locations, and actually the order of where they visited those locations. So we use that. We separate out individual material from the soles of a shoe. So we can be looking at several questioned items from the sole of a shoe, which might take us to the place where the fight took place, the place where the body was buried, and the home address of the suspect, or any combination or other locations.
Right. So if you had to sum up, because what I'm sort of starting hearing a repeating theme here, but if you had to sum up the main purpose of soil forensics, how would you describe it to a jury, for example, or someone who wasn't aware of what it was?
I'd really focus on two main areas. So the first would be that single question sample submitted on a spade or a pair of boots or a jacket, submitted to the labs with a question, where could that have come from? So the police don't know where it was used to dig. They don't know where the person had been, but that is a suspect. So they want to know where that person's been. That is helping the police in that search phase of an investigation. The other side is later on, as the investigation develops, they discover the body. And when the body is discovered, that scene has to be sampled appropriately. And so the forensic geoscientist would come in at that stage and either provide advice to the SOCOs at the scene, or would attend the scene themselves to assist with the sampling of the reference and soil, the control samples at and around the scene, and equally as important, on the route out or in of that scene, whether by foot, by bicycle, or by vehicle. So the sampling, and then appropriate sampling, and then that next stage is the comparison of that unknown sample with the samples at the scene, and then a trace evidence comparison of the question samples with the known samples from the scene. Now, if they are then comparable, we would run it with several different types of analyses to give an increasing evidential strength that that soil could have come from that location. But then comes the other question is, but where else could that question sample have come from? It could have equally well have come from the home address of the suspect, or an alibi location. So therefore, the sampling has to go to another phase to get the alternative proposition that the soil on the shoe came from that alternative location, rather than the proposition that it came from the crime scene. So one is to stay open-minded. As we know in forensic science, there's always two sides to the story.
Yes, of course. And I believe once you said something about, for example, bias and working with blind samples. And I was going to ask you about that, and just how does that typically work when you're working with police? Because I mean, I have my own cases, and sometimes people want to offer you all the details and want to give you everything else. And it gets to a point where you're like, I really don't need to know that, and you want to be polite, and you don't want to tell somebody to shut up, but they are offering a little bit too much information. So how do you handle that?
Well, it's important to know the forensic context. So that's where it is good if you're involved as a forensic geoscientist in the forensic strategy meetings. But however, you don't really want to know about the individuals, the suspects that are involved. unless it's relevant to developing that GIS model that might help work out where to actually search to find the missing object or person. It's better to not know, to have as least influence as possible about these external factors, as long as it doesn't influence your evaluation of the data or the context of priors or pre or sin events. But one of the important things we do is when we're extracting the soils, we give them a lab code, so a unique identifier, so they no longer are linked to their production or their exhibit number. So that unique barcode, so let's say there's a subsample put to the X-ray diffraction lab to run on mineralogy, then the technician who runs the sample doesn't know anything about any of the samples. So they are done absolutely blind. And the interpretation is done by the expert, not knowing where all these reference samples came from. So they don't know which one's the home address, they don't know which one's the crime scene. And that tries to minimize any potential bias. So we don't retranslate them to their actual identity of production number until the very end when we're writing up the report. And that hopefully minimizes any potential bias. Of course, you can't eliminate it completely, but we try to also run proficiency tests and collaborative exercises within the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes, this animal plant soil trace group. Every year we run mock cases, and the samples are sent round all the laboratories, and you have to submit a report based on how you would normally write a forensic report. So it's really good. That's totally done blind as well. So it's a good check that you're coming to the right conclusions.
Yeah, for sure. The you talked about bias, but there's some interesting studies that you've worked on. I'd like to bring one up to ask you about, because before you talked about where you find a body, and so this one is entitled "Temporal Fatty Acid Profiles of Human Decomposition Fluid in Soil." And my understanding here, just very briefly, is that there's a body that's been decomposing for approximately 18 days, and then it becomes removed. And you can still do some type of soil analysis and determine some things about it. Can you kind of fill me in on some of the things that you've done here?
Well, this is an important area, and I know you've had Shari Forbes on talking about body farms. This is another application of the use of organic profiles in soils, but to help determine when a body had been there and if a body had been there and how long it had been there. So this is using gas chromatography mass spectrometry. So it lets us quantify and identify individual compound types. For example, fecal steroids, stanols, bile acids, and tissue-derived steroids such as cholesterol, coprostanol, cholesterol, all these compounds that are left behind in the soil when there has been a body decomposing there. So this was a lot of work that we did with Barbara von der Loo. She's currently in Göttingen in Germany, and she did her master's with us and then her PhD with us in Aberdeen. And she first worked on pigs, and indeed in that study on the pigs was done in Canada back then with Shari Forbes originally, when we looked at pig surrogates for, they're the best surrogate for decomposition of the human body. So these particular compounds, they change over time and they move down the soil profile. So this study showed that they're not in the controls, so they're very powerful as indicators of human decomposition. And there are a distinctive suite of compounds which tell us that it's human and not dog or sheep or cow. All those different things, they provide some of the same compounds, but not the full suite of those that are human. So there's more work going on. In fact, we're collaborating with Portugal, University CESPU there, with a PhD with another student profile. So we're trying to look at other indicators, and in different soils are the same indicators a robust way of indicating that there had been a human there and how long ago.
I was interested also in the fact that, it talks about a year later, there's still, that you're still able to discern, certain things. So the fact that there's this temporal significance, I think, is really important as well. Is that typically
And the
common?
important thing about that is that these indicators, the cholesterol, coprostanol, they move down the soil profile. So initially they're in the very surface layer, but over time, with the leachates moving down the soil, you need to take your soil cores deeper as well to pick up these over time, say a year later. So again, that's informing on sampling protocols as well, if we're wanting to use these as reliable indicators.
You mentioned Portugal, and I noticed that you've done you must have some colleagues there because there's a bit of work that's been going on in Portugal as well. But there was a paper here that talked about organic matter characterization of sediments in 2 river beaches from northern Portugal for forensic applications. And it started to address one of the questions I had, which is how well or how accurately can you discern soils from 2 different regions? And in some cases it may be obvious even, but I can see in some cases it could be extremely difficult too. But can you tell me a little bit about the work that was done here in this particular paper?
And again, this is a wonderful example of collaboration and the power of people, students coming and studying and moving about and going to different countries to work. And this was Aurea Carvalho from Porto in Portugal. And she came over to do her master's and her PhD with us in Aberdeen, where she analysed the samples that she'd collected in her home country in Portugal. And by looking at these soils, you wouldn't be able to discriminate them. They were very similar. So even looking under the microscope, these beach sands were pretty homogeneous. But when we looked at the organic profiles within the soils, even within the same beach, 2 meters apart, you could distinguish the 2 different areas on that beach. And this happened right the way up the transect from the edge of the beach right the way up to the dune stabilization zone. So it shows that these other methods can help discriminate organic sources. And also it's a combination. I think in this study we showed that the mineral profile varied, elemental profile varied, but at a different scale. So these inorganic characteristics varied at about a kilometer scale, while the organic profiles varied at about a meter scale. So much more discriminating at the crime scene scale, for example.
Okay. In terms of the equipment that you're using, what kind of tools do you have in your laboratory that help you, sort of cover all the range of different types of analyses that you're going to be running?
Well, because we are a institute that has specialized in soil science for 50 years, we have carried out soil survey. We've got the appropriate soil maps, soil databases that has built up over time. We've also got the analytical facilities that are appropriate for characterizing soils. So from color determination using Munsell color books, using the microscope. That would be my number one tool. Always look at your sample first with a macro lens and with a light microscope. They are the most important tools. Look at your sample before you decide what you're going to do with it. Then we've also got the tools of particle size diffraction using laser diffraction. We've got pH, we've got FTIR, we've got SE scanning electron microscopy, we've got ICP for the full profile elemental analysis. We've got a whole range of different methods also that we can apply depending on what that soil is like. And in our organic lab, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry are used to characterize the organics in these soils, as well as DNA. We've got soil DNA, we've got a soil DNA database. So we can look at environmental DNA as well to ascertain information about the environment where a particular soil has come from. So yeah, we're very fortunate in our institute that we've got state-of-the-art facilities that the team can provide that expertise to analyze and characterize whatever type of soils are submitted to us.
Yes, I can see you can have a lot of fun in your lab. You've got all kinds of toys to play with, which is good to know. That's great that you're funded so well too. I think that's fantastic. Question about I talked about the hardware, but I'm curious about the types of analyses and perhaps software or maybe artificial intelligence, neural networks, and these types of things that may help in some of the more complicated cases. Is that something that is being looked at now or potentially in the future?
Again, we're very fortunate in that we have got a department, information technology, and in collaboration with them, we developed a neural network model. So it used all the data that's been built up in the database to help geoprovenance. So for a question sample, we put in the characteristics that we analyzed into this neural network model, and it would come up with the probabilities of which types of soils, which areas that unknown soil had come from. So yeah, fantastic. We've also got a department that deals with virtual reality, so we can recreate the scene based on the information that we gather using photography at the scene. So yeah, we're very fortunate having a
Excellent.
lot of people with expertise to work with.
I'd like to bring up a question here from one of the listeners here. And he says, as far as crime scene workflow, where does this fit into the overall concept of crime scene processing? And I guess it also brings up the question, do the police, for example, locally to you, do they understand that, oh, we better collect this because, it's not just dirt they brush off anymore. Now it's like, oh, wait a second, this could be valuable here. So do people know what to do with it once they have it or how to collect it?
Well, again, I think it would depend on which country you're talking about. Very fortunate in that we've been building this up within Scotland. And for the last 15 years, since a police officer came along with a spade and some soil in it and said, can you help us? You're a soil institute. Can you help us work out where the soil came from? So we did. We ran it and we worked out it was a forest nearby. And when they went there, they found the drugs that had been buried in that forest. So it was originally developed as proof of concept with the local police force. And we have one unified police force, Police Scotland in Scotland. And I help at the crime scene manager training course. So from the very first time that they're developing their crime scene manager skills, they're aware of what soil is about, what vegetation is about, what it can help them, and also what it can't help them to do. And also that we don't have to be at every scene, but we've developed guidelines so that they can phone us up to get some advice, or they can look at the guidelines that we've written, or if it's a serious incident, we can attend. So there's a whole range of different options available to the investigating authority. But in England and Wales, it's slightly different because sadly we no longer have the Forensic Science Service, which was a government-funded organisation. And we set up a soil laboratory within the FSS. And that was ideal because every force knew just the capabilities that what could be done with soil and associated vegetation. But now it depends which police force that you're talking about, because some have got that capability in-house. Others work with organisations such as Cellmark or Electroforensics. These organisations in England, Wales, and they subcontract some of the soil works for us to do in Aberdeen. So yeah, it just depends how the training goes in those different forces and what experience they've had working with soil and vegetation in the past. I think that will influence very much how that particular organisation thinks about soil trace evidence.
There was another paper that you did, which is a case actually, and it has to do with analyzing a small clot of soil to help solve a murder case. And I believe this one had to do with there's a victim that's found far away from her home, kind of thing, and then there's a suspect, and on the suspect vehicle, there's some soil, and I believe some of it was on like one of the like the side rear view mirror. I think it might have been on the passenger side, and then there might have been some on the fender. So can you talk about the what happened in this particular case? Because this is in Brazil. So I don't know if they were already very familiar with soil forensics, or is this something that they contacted you to assist with?
Well, this is a really nice example because this again is the power of these international networks, in that the collaboration that's built up between both the federal police, the police department, Fabio de Silva Salvador, for example, he's a geologist who was working in the police and reached out to us within the International Union of Geological Sciences Initiative of Forensic Geology. And he had a student, Samara Testoni, who is the second author on this paper. And she came over to our country to help to do her PhD. And she learned the methods that we developed. She learned the approaches, and she applied it in this particular case, working with Fabio Salvador at the police. And now it's integral to across the different states in Brazil, and now they're integrating it within their criminal justice system. And it was a tiny amount. You can see there the fender and the little bit underneath the car, a very small amount, but that was enough, less than 500 milligrams. And that was enough to run a sequence of analyses, both inorganic and organic, to be able to establish that the alibi of the suspect, where he said he had picked up that soil from his home address in Colombo, I think it was.
Colombo, yeah.
Yeah, but we could show that it absolutely could not have come from there, because the mineralogy was totally different, and it was the same mineralogy that was at the Gracio Road at Parana, where indeed the body of the victim was found. So, and this was just wonderful because it demonstrated the benefit of international collaboration, the transfer of knowledge, and the wonderful experience that we had having Dr. Samara Testoni work in our laboratory and take that back. And we're continuing that collaboration to this day.
You talked about the biology that's in the soil. So is it just like a DNA analysis that you do on the microbes, and then you start making comparisons? Or because I believe there is, and I'm sure I have it here, there's another paper that you did as well, looking at the microbes as well. But what's the significance of microbes, and how valuable are they in soil forensics?
The living part. So we've talked about the inorganic part, the mineralogy, and how that was important in the last case that we talked about in Brazil, in discriminating between where a sample came from because of the difference in geology. And we talked about how the organics can tell us about decomposition, and the products left in the soil can tell us that there has or has not been likely been a body there. And it can discriminate, such as in Portugal, at the scale of a meter. But what we've got with the living part of soil, that biology, the DNA, that can be very, very important, because it can tell us about the living part and what is living and growing in that soil. It can discriminate at even a millimeter scale. Now, that can be very powerful, but it can also be too much information and at too high a resolution, because if you're looking at discriminating between two footprints, let's say at a scene, it's going to give too much information. And what we need to do is more research to narrow it down to know which part of that, say, full genome sequence is going to be discriminating, rather than having to look at the full profile. So a bit like human DNA, if we're able to narrow it down to which organisms are going to be distinctive to that parkland where the crime took place, as opposed to the home address, the grassland outside where the suspect said he had been, we need to be developing methods and the databases associated with it, and the informatics, the bioinformatics. And this is why we're working with biostatisticians, because when you're looking at soil DNA, we've got millions of organisms. Human DNA, there's one DNA that compares for that and matches that person. With the soil, we've got the bacteria, we've got the fungi, we've got archaea, we've got the mites. There's more organisms in a teaspoonful of soil than there are people living on the planet. So huge amount of information. And I think it's going to be the future, but I still think there's a bit more research before it can be used safely in casework.
Can I ask you about some of the transfer itself? So, for example, the fact that a tire rolls in the mud or something, or you can see, like in the case from Brazil, that you have these projected soil, wet soil that's up on the vehicle, or for example, where it is on the clothing. And so, what about is the mechanism of transfer often looked at from your side?
It's a very important point, and different types of soil and different weather conditions and different environments can affect that level of transfer. For example, a soil that's a high degree of clay, so that's a very fine sized particles, a soil that's got organic matter, and if they're all wet, then they will transfer and persist for a fair period of time, depending on where else that person goes after the point that they've made contact. But what we need to do is more research on that to understand how we can predict the period that it will persist on different types of materials. So it'll stick to a piece of painted bodywork for a different length of time than it will stick to the fabric of a seat cover, for example. And different parts of the soil will penetrate different depths of a jumper. So there was a rape case where there was soil that had adhered to the outer clothing and the underwear of a alleged victim. And the material that had gone into the weft, the material of the fabric, was different. So when we were looking at the control samples, we took fabric of the same material and subsampled. So we were taking the soil in the same way as it would have transferred onto the material of the alleged suspect. So that could then test whether the soil where the alleged crime had taken place was actually the soil that was on the alleged victim's clothing. And indeed, in that case, we showed that it could not have occurred at that location because the soil was totally different. So the person admitted making that up. So again, it was being independent and providing the evidence no matter what it showed to the court to be objective and unbiased.
You've worked on a lot of different cases, and the one that sort of comes up every time, like if you do searches for your name and things like that, is the World's End Pub. That one seems to be a big one. And can you talk to us a little bit about that case and the significance of your work there?
Well, like a lot of cases, the forensic soil scientist or the forensic geologist plays a part. It's part of that whole jigsaw. This actually took place, the double murder of Helen Scott and Christine Eadie in Edinburgh in 1975. And very sadly, there was no suspect found for many years. In those days, there was no DNA. There was no DNA database. But thankfully, it was Lothian and Borders Police team. They recovered all the evidence at the time, and despite there no victim being found, the advancement of technology, the advancement of crime light, the advancement of the DNA allowed them to look at the ligatures and the knots within the ligatures and extract the DNA from under the knots. And from that, they were able to then, as time went on, and the DNA, the database built up, and Angus Sinclair came up as a match against the DNA in the ligature. Now, his alibi was that he had gone fishing and that it was his brother-in-law who'd actually killed both girls. But what we looked at the soil that had been kept from Helen's feet, and we showed by the organic analysis of those soils that she'd stood or walked in two different places. One in the field where she was found naked from the waist down, and also the soil at the edge of that field. So the prosecutors deduced that she had likely walked into that field to her death. And the combination of the DNA evidence and the soil evidence refuted the alibi of Angus Sinclair, and he was found guilty of committing that murder and sentenced to 37 years in prison.
So even in the same field, you were able to discern between something at the soil at the edge of the field to something which was, later, I don't know how many yards or how many meters further beyond?
That's the power of the organic profiling method, in that it can discriminate different patches in your garden. So any bit of the garden that's had a different history of management, a different history of vegetative inputs, will have a different signature. And we can pick that up using gas chromatography. So like the beach in Portugal, in Porto, we can tell the foreshore from 2 meters up from that foreshore. So if someone says they were assaulted at the edge of that beach line, but it was actually further up, we can identify that location using organic profiling methods.
Just a couple more questions maybe, but what are some of the areas right now in your area in soil forensics that need work, or what do you see as the big opportunities where people should be jumping on at the moment?
I think the area of soil DNA and the use of environmental DNA. So in developing intelligence, so getting data that can help and assist in the inquiries, not necessarily always as evidence, but to help provide the clues to help tackle serious and organized crime. And increasingly, that can be used and applied in such disciplines as wildlife crime or environmental crime. So it's the same principles of working out what is the likelihood of that soil that has been found on someone's clothing, tools, or vehicle having come from that location, and working out, helping the police work out where that location was, and using smaller and smaller amounts of material, but building up the confidence of your evaluation about that small trace material, and having the databases validated, accredited, and robust databases that we can share internationally. I really hope that that will happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay. And is that something you're actually working on now, or have you started that, or is that something that's still to come for you?
We are working on that. And the other area that I feel is very important is the evaluation of the data, because in different countries, depending on the legal environment, so the criminal justice system, whether it's adversarial, such as in Canada, the United States, UK, Australia, South Africa, or whether it's the inquisitorial system, such as that we get in mainland Europe, different conditions, these different legal constraints will affect how these different methods are adopted within these different systems. However, it's important that the expert and the forensic geoscientist always stays with a duty to the court, whatever system that they work in. And we need to evaluate it in the right manner, so that cannot exclude it, cannot be the furthest that we can go. For example, in the Netherlands, they use a Bayesian approach, so they can infer the likelihood ratio of a soil having come from a scene relative to another location. Whereas in the United States, it's much more difficult to get any statistical or Bayesian approach adopted. And in Australia, it's a degree of comparability scale that's used. So I think we need to get some unification, particularly with when we're dealing with crimes that are of an international nature. We need to make it easier for law enforcement to understand what we mean when we give an evidential value.
For those who want to learn more, or let's say, for example, sometimes there are students who watch these this forensics talk series, but what would you recommend as sort of the best path for them to lead into something like soil forensics? Is it geology that you should start with?
I think that would be the first thing, is to get a really good undergraduate degree in either geology, geography, soil science. So become the scientist, become what is your discipline base. and then at that stage decide to do a master's or a PhD with the forensic science as part of that investigation. And then you're trained also to apply and work in analytical labs anywhere. It doesn't have to be forensic science, but if you study that master's or that PhD in forensic science, it'll let you really work out whether you do want to work in the forensic arena. But if you've done a good undergraduate degree, you can always change your mind, because when you're going out from school to choose your subject to study, you really don't know what you want to do later on in life. So keep your options open.
Yeah, that's true. That's for sure. For those who want to maybe potentially reach out to you, or they have some additional information, is it okay if I show your email address?
Yes, that's fine. That my
Okay.
work email address, I'm happy to take emails
Yes,
from people.
and I think that's this right here. So for those of you that are interested in learning more, you can contact Professor Dawson here. She's also, let me see if I can share the screen here. But there's plenty of information on the internet if you want to look her up on YouTube. She's got some great presentations. You did a TEDx, the TEDx Aberdeen, correct?
That's correct. And that was a great experience. I would recommend it to anyone. It was hard, it was tough going, but it was really worth it, especially meeting people and learning to story tell, but tell it accurately.
That when was that? What year was that?
That was in COVID. So we did all our training virtually, online. But the first time we met was live on stage to film.
Wow, what an experience! That's pretty neat. Well, look, Lorna, thank you so much. I think you have a really interesting discipline. I mean, I learned a ton just by reading and from listening to you and everything else. I think you have a cool job, and I can see why you're passionate and why you probably look forward to waking up in the morning and going to the lab. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
All right. Hey, hang back if you get a chance, and I'll talk to you in just a moment.
Bye.
All right, folks. Well, that does it for this particular episode. Don't forget that we will be back next week. Actually, next week, it looks like we're going to be talking about conducted energy weapons and taser weapons and that sort of thing. So if you're interested, that should be a very interesting one. It's not a subject that we get a lot of exposure to. And don't forget, if you're interested in the photogrammetry class that's coming up, that's going to be Tuesday and Wednesday next week. And we'll be covering a whole bunch of different topics or on how to create 3D models and looking at photogrammetry and photography and how to use your digital camera. So on that note, folks, all the best, and we shall see you soon. Bye-bye.